Breathitt County, Kentucky, 1879. While every settler rushed to throw up cabins before winter, Robert Vaughn stood beside a growing pile of rejected logs, 47 pieces of timber that his hired crew thought were perfectly good for building. In 3 weeks, he'd turned down more usable wood than most men needed for an entire cabin. His neighbor Jim Crawford called it wasteful. The community called him a fool. Vaughn demanded logs with no more than 2 inches of taper over 20 feet. Others accepted 4 to 6 inches. He wanted 12 growth rings per inch or more. Others used fast-grown valley timber with half that density. He cut only in winter when a sap flow stopped completely. Others harvested whenever convenient. Crawford finished his own cabin in 12 days using standard timber selection. Vaughn spent 18 days just choosing his logs, paying crew wages the whole time. Then came the test of decades. By 1889, Crawford's cabin required major renovation. 7 logs needed replacement due to severe checking and warping. The southeast corner had settled 3 inches, creating structural stress throughout. Meanwhile, Vaughn's cabin showed minimal gaps, perhaps 8 linear feet of minor touch-ups in 10 years. No structural movement, no log replacement needed. Crawford's practical approach cost $47 in maintenance over a decade. Vaughn's perfectionist selection required $3.50. What did Robert Vaughn understand about wood science and long-term performance that an entire community of experienced builders missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The morning mist hung low over the Kentucky hills when Robert Vaughn rejected his first log of the day. October 15, 1879, and the 27-year-old mountaineer stood beside what his hired crew considered a perfectly serviceable piece of white oak. 20 feet long, straight as a gun barrel, thick enough to make any frontier cabin proud. But Vaughn ran his hand along the bark, measuring with practiced fingers, and shook his head. "Too much taper," he announced to the bewildered loggers. 7 inches at the butt, 4 at the top. Won't do." The crew exchanged glances. In 3 weeks of cutting, they'd watched Vaughn turn down timber that would have built half the cabins in Breathitt County. His standards defied every practical consideration that governed frontier construction, where speed meant survival and perfection was a luxury no sensible man could afford. Jim Crawford, building his own cabin just 2 ridges over, had already selected his logs, cut them, and started notching. Vaughn was still walking through the forest with his measuring stick, rejecting more wood than he accepted. Heinrich Vaughn had taught his son that a cabin's foundation lay not in its stones, but in the quality of its logs. The elder Vaughn, carrying Black Forest timber knowledge from his German father, had spent 40 years adapting Old World standards to Appalachian conditions. "A log carries the mountain's story in its rings," he'd told Robert during countless walks through the timber. "Read it wrong, and your cabin will tell that story back to you every winter for the next 40 years. Robert's criteria emerged through methodical inspection that frustrated his crew to the point of mutiny. No log could show more than 2 inches of taper over its 20-foot length. The growth rings had to count 12 or more per inch, tight, even bands that spoke of slow growth and dense fiber. Every piece had to come from north-facing slopes where steady shade and consistent moisture produced uniform wood density. The grain ran straight and true, with no spiral twist that might work itself into warping as the log seasoned. Most critically, every tree fell between November and February when a sap flow stopped and moisture content reached its annual minimum. Crawford's approach represented pure frontier pragmatism. Any reasonably straight log qualified for his walls. Taper didn't matter much. The thick end went down, the thin end up, and mud chinking filled whatever gaps emerged. Valley timber cut in July when work was convenient served as well as ridge timber cut in winter's bitter cold. Fast-grown logs with wide growth rings meant big trees harvested quickly, and in a territory where winter could kill the unprepared, speed trumped perfection every time. The community watched Vaughn's obsessive selection with growing incredulity. While neighbors raised walls and chinked gaps, preparing for the brutal Kentucky winter that could arrive without warning, Vaughn continued his timber inspection. His father's voice echoed in every rejected log. Wood shrinkage occurred primarily perpendicular to the growth rings, meaning fast-grown logs with wide rings would shrink unevenly, creating gaps and warps that widened with every seasonal cycle. Tapered logs compounded the problem, their thick and thin ends drying at different rates, creating wedge-shaped voids that no amount of chinking could permanently seal. By early November, Vaughn had inspected over 200 logs and approved 63. His lumber pile represented nearly 4 weeks of selection from prime timber that Crawford could have processed in 8 days. The crew calculated their extended wages against the standard rate for cabin logs, and the math staggered them. Vaughn was paying 3 times the going rate for materials that looked identical to what everyone else used. Crawford shook his head as he passed Vaughn's building site. "That's the most expensive pile of logs in Kentucky," he declared to anyone within earshot. "Hope your perfect timber keeps you warmer than my practical cabin keeps me." The scientific foundation underlying Vaughn's empirical knowledge remained invisible to his critics. Winter-cut logs contained significantly less moisture than summer-harvested timber, meaning dimensional change would be minimal as they continued seasoning in the wall. Dense, slow-grown wood from north-facing slopes had smaller cell structures and higher lignin content, creating superior dimensional stability and resistance to checking. Straight grain provided predictable, uniform shrinkage patterns, while spiral grain created torsional stress that expressed itself through warping and twisting as the wood aged. Crawford's cabin took shape rapidly through November, his walls rising in steady daily increments, while Vaughn continued his methodical selection process. Standard frontier practice demanded completion before serious cold arrived, and Crawford's 12-day construction timeline reflected decades of proven experience across Ohio and Indiana. His logs showed the normal range of taper and growth characteristics found in typical Appalachian timber, selected for adequacy rather than perfection, chinked with the mud and stone mixture that had weatherproofed thousands of frontier homes. December snow began falling as Vaughn finally started construction, his selected logs arranged by size and taper for optimal placement in the wall. Each piece had been chosen not just for its individual quality, but for its relationship to the logs above and below, creating a wall system where minimal gaps would develop as the wood aged and settled. The extra time spent in selection translated to faster construction, as properly matched logs required less fitting and adjustment during the building process. Crawford's completed cabin stood as testament to practical frontier wisdom, functional, economical, and ready for occupancy while Vaughn still worked in the snow. The community's verdict seemed clear. Perfectionist standards were a luxury that frontier life couldn't support, and Vaughn's obsessive timber selection represented wasteful idealism that ignored the harsh realities of mountain survival. Spring 1881 brought the first whispers of trouble to Crawford's cabin. What began as hairline cracks between logs in the previous summer had widened to gaps thick enough to slip a pencil through. Every Saturday morning found Crawford mixing fresh mud chinking, working methodically around his walls to fill the growing spaces that winter had opened and spring rain had washed clean. His logs, cut from fast-growing valley timber in July 1877 when sap ran thick and sweet, were telling their story through checking and twisting as they continued their relentless process of seasoning. The mechanics of wood movement operated invisibly but relentlessly within Crawford's walls. Tangential shrinkage in his fast-grown logs reached 8 to 12% as moisture content dropped toward equilibrium with the mountaineer. Each log contracted perpendicular to its growth rings, and the wide rings of valley timber created uneven stress patterns that expressed themselves through surface checking and internal warping. More problematically, his tapered logs created compound settlement issues as their thick and thin ends compressed at different rates, generating wedge-shaped gaps that widened with every seasonal cycle. By late spring, the pattern had spread beyond Crawford's homestead. Miller's place showed major checking in the south-facing wall logs, where afternoon sun accelerated moisture loss and created thermal stress that split the wood along its grain. 3 logs required complete replacement as checking penetrated deep enough to compromise structural integrity. The Peterson cabin revealed severe warping in corner logs, where hidden reaction wood finally expressed its internal tension, twisting the timbers out of their original alignment and creating gaps that no amount of chinking could seal. Thompson's cabin displayed the most dramatic failure as 15 logs showed significant spiral movement. The trees had grown with invisible spiral grain that appeared straight to casual inspection, but carried torsional stress throughout their fiber. As the logs seasoned in the wall, this hidden characteristic manifested itself through twisting that opened gaps along the entire length of affected timbers. Thompson found himself rechinking the same areas repeatedly as the wood continued its slow rotation within the wall structure. A systematic survey of 5 cabins built between 1879 and 1880 revealed a consistent pattern of deterioration. Crawford's cabin required 127 linear feet of gap filling, representing nearly 40% of his total wall length. Miller's homestead needed major structural work, as 3 load-bearing logs developed checks deep enough to threaten the cabin's stability. Peterson faced complete corner reconstruction where warped logs had created a cascade failure affecting the entire northeast section of his building. The cumulative maintenance represented hundreds of hours of labor and dozens of dollars in materials for problems that seemed to multiply faster than repairs could address them. Vaughn's cabin stood in stark contrast to the community's struggles. A careful inspection revealed minimal gaps totaling perhaps 20 linear feet scattered across all 4 walls, mostly in locations where his perfectionist standards had been slightly relaxed on a handful of logs that didn't quite meet his ideal criteria. No rechinking had been necessary, and the walls remained tight and weatherproof through the seasonal cycles that were devastating his neighbor's construction. Crawford dismissed this performance as temporary luck, predicting that time would reveal similar problems in Vaughn's structure. Winter 18. 81 to 1882 brought unusual cold that tested every cabin in the county. Temperatures reached 18 degrees below zero for 6 consecutive nights, and the sustained cold created thermal stress that accelerated the failure of marginal construction. Standard cabins required constant maintenance as logs continued their movement, opening new gaps faster than residents could fill them. Families burned extra firewood fighting drafts through widening cracks that let precious heat escape and bitter cold penetrate their living spaces. The economic impact of poor log selection became quantifiable through the winter's harsh test. Crawford calculated that he was burning 25% more firewood than expected. The extra fuel needed to compensate for heat loss through gaps that standard chinking couldn't permanently seal. His neighbors reported similar increases in fuel consumption, along with the ongoing labor costs of weekend maintenance sessions that diverted time from other essential frontier tasks. Spring 1882 brought a sobering assessment as the community inspected winter's damage. Crawford's cabin showed new checking in 8 additional logs, while existing gaps had widened beyond the capacity of mud chinking to bridge effectively. Several neighbors had resorted to stuffing cloth strips and wood chips into the largest openings before applying fresh chinking, creating temporary patches that would require replacement with the next seasonal cycle. The cumulative effect was cabins that looked increasingly weathered and patchwork despite being less than 3 years old. Samuel Hayes, the county's most experienced builder with 30 years of log construction throughout Kentucky and Tennessee, began taking notice of the performance differences. Hayes had initially supported conventional building methods based on his extensive experience, but the measurable disparities in structural performance challenged his assumptions about proper construction techniques. During his spring inspection rounds, helping neighbors assess winter damage, he observed that conventional wisdom was producing consistently inferior results compared to Vaughn's approach. The technical explanation for the performance gap lay in fundamental wood science that frontier builders understood imperfectly. Vaughn's winter-cut low-sap logs had undergone significant moisture loss before installation, meaning dimensional change during their service life remained minimal. His dense, straight-grain timber from north-facing slopes maintained structural relationships over time, while fast-grown logs with irregular grain patterns developed internal stresses that expressed themselves through warping and checking. The thermal performance advantages were equally significant, as tight-fitting logs created consistent barriers against heat loss, while gaps from poor selection allowed air infiltration that could increase heating costs by 30 to 40%. Crawford's private admission to his wife that spring carried grudging recognition of what he'd witnessed. Maybe the man wasn't as foolish as we thought, he conceded, though publicly he maintained that Vaughn's success represented temporary luck rather than superior methodology. The evidence, however, was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as seasonal cycles continued to reveal the long-term consequences of material selection decisions made during those critical construction weeks 3 years earlier. 1889 marked the decade milestone that revealed the true measure of log selection standards. Crawford's cabin, once the symbol of practical frontier wisdom, now required major renovation to remain habitable. The original chinking had failed in 89% of the joints, creating a patchwork of gaps that made the structure look decades older than its 10 years. 7 logs needed complete replacement due to severe checking and warping that had progressed beyond repair, while the southeast corner had settled 3 inches lower than the northwest corner, creating structural stress that radiated throughout the entire frame. The mathematics of Crawford's maintenance told a sobering story. Over 10 years, he had invested $47 in materials and countless hours of labor attempting to keep his cabin weather-tight, nearly equal to what he had saved by rushing construction and using standard timber selection. The irony was lost on no one in the community. The practical approach had become the most expensive and labor-intensive building in the county. Crawford's ledger documented re-chinking sessions every 18 months, emergency repairs after severe weather, and the gradual replacement of components that should have lasted decades. A systematic review of 12 cabins built between 1879 and 1881 revealed patterns that challenged every assumption about frontier construction economics. The average structure required major log replacement affecting 15 to 20% of the original timber within the first decade. 75% needed foundation releveling as uneven settling created structural problems that cascaded through the entire building. Door and window frames required constant adjustment as walls shifted and settled unpredictably, creating operational problems that affected daily life beyond mere maintenance costs. The community had unconsciously developed a maintenance culture around their cabins, accepting annual repairs and periodic reconstruction as normal aspects of frontier life. Families planned their schedules around chinking sessions, budgeted for replacement logs, and adapted to living spaces that changed dimensions with the seasons as gaps opened and closed with temperature and humidity cycles. What they had accepted as the inevitable cost of log construction was actually the consequence of material selection decisions made during those crucial weeks of initial building. Vaughn's cabin stood as an increasingly obvious anomaly in this landscape of deteriorating structures. A detailed inspection revealed performance that bordered on the miraculous by community standards. Approximately 8 linear feet of minor touch-ups represented the sum total of maintenance requirements over the entire decade. No logs required replacement. Structural movement measured less than half an inch and was distributed uniformly throughout the foundation, indicating normal settling rather than the differential movement that plagued neighboring structures. The economic comparison staggered those who calculated it carefully. Vaughn's maintenance costs totaled $3.50 over 10 years, mostly for replacement door hinges worn through use rather than structural movement. His heating fuel requirements remained 30 to 40% below comparable structures, as tight-fitting logs maintained consistent thermal barriers, while gaps in conventional construction created air infiltration that forced residents to burn additional firewood, compensating for heat loss. The initial investment in careful selection had paid dividends that compounded annually through reduced operational costs. Samuel Hayes found himself reassessing 30 years of building experience as the evidence accumulated beyond dispute. Hayes had constructed over 200 frontier structures across Kentucky and Tennessee using conventional methods that emphasized speed and economy over material perfection. His professional reputation rested on practical techniques that got families into weatherproof shelter before winter's arrival. Yet Vaughn's results challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between construction time, material costs, and long-term performance. The technical explanation for Vaughn's superior results lay in compound effects that multiplied over time. His low-sap, winter-cut logs had reached equilibrium moisture content before installation, eliminating the ongoing shrinkage that created problems in standard construction. Dense wood from slow-growing North Slope timber maintained its structural integrity under seasonal stress cycles that caused checking and warping in fast-grown valley timber. Straight grain provided predictable behavior that allowed precise fitting during construction and stable performance throughout the structure's service life. More subtly, Vaughn's systematic approach to log selection had created walls where individual timbers worked together as an integrated system. Each log's taper, density, and grain characteristics had been matched to its position in the wall and its relationship to adjacent timbers. Standard construction treated logs as interchangeable components, leading to random combinations that created stress concentrations and movement patterns that opened gaps unpredictably. Vaughn's method produced walls that moved as units, distributing stress evenly and maintaining structural relationships over time. The broader implications extended beyond individual cabin performance to challenge accepted wisdom about frontier economics. The community had operated under the assumption that speed and economy in construction represented practical wisdom adapted to harsh frontier conditions. Vaughn's decade of superior performance suggested that this wisdom was false economy, creating ongoing costs that far exceeded any initial savings from rushed construction and casual material selection. Crawford's visit to Vaughn's homestead in late 1889 marked a pivotal moment in the community's understanding. Facing major reconstruction costs that would exceed the original building expense, Crawford swallowed his pride and asked about purchasing logs for repairs. For the first time in 10 years, he inquired about Vaughn's selection criteria, seeking to understand standards he had previously dismissed as perfectionist foolishness. The conversation revealed how completely the community had misunderstood Vaughn's methodology. What they had interpreted as wasteful perfectionism represented systematic application of traditional knowledge that optimized long-term performance rather than short-term convenience. Vaughn's rejection of 60% of available timber wasn't arbitrary pickiness, but careful selection based on characteristics that predicted decades of structural behavior. His extended construction timeline wasn't procrastination, but time invested in material assessment that prevented problems, rather than reacting to them after they developed. Hayes began incorporating elements of Vaughn's approach into his own construction projects, initially with skepticism, but growing confidence as results validated the methodology. Other experienced builders quietly adopted modified versions of Vaughn's standards, though few admitted publicly that their professional expertise had been incomplete. The decade mark had provided definitive proof that traditional knowledge, properly applied, produced measurably superior results to conventional frontier wisdom. 1919 brought the ultimate validation of Robert Vaughn's methodology, as 40 years of documented performance created an undeniable record of superior construction. The Great War had ended, ushering in an era of industrial progress that encouraged systematic analysis of traditional building techniques. Crawford's cabin, now owned by his nephew following Jim's death in 1908, had undergone complete reconstruction twice, major renovations in 1895 and again in 1913 when structural failure made the original building uninhabitable. The economic devastation of Crawford's approach had compounded relentlessly over 4 decades. Current ownership records estimated total maintenance costs at $340, plus countless hours of labor that represented additional economic value in a cash-scarce frontier economy. The cabin that had symbolized practical wisdom and efficient construction had become a monument to false economy, consuming resources annually while providing increasingly marginal shelter. Every major storm brought new damage, every severe winter opened fresh gaps, and every spring revealed additional structural problems that required immediate attention. A comprehensive survey of 23 cabins built between 1875 and 1885 revealed performance patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about frontier construction. Standard construction methodology had produced average lifespans of 12 to 15 years without major renovation, with 68% of structures requiring complete reconstruction within 2 decades. The ongoing maintenance requirements included annual chinking, biennial log inspection, and frequent minor repairs that consumed significant portions of family labor and resources. 31% had developed serious foundation or corner issues that threatened structural integrity and habitability. Professional assessment by the county building assessor documented Vaughn's cabin performance with precision that eliminated any possibility of coincidental success. 94% of the original logs remained in service at full structural capacity after 4 decades of Kentucky weather. Interior temperature variation during blizzard conditions measured only 8 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to 20 to 25 degree swings in typical cabins where gaps and air infiltration created uncomfortable living conditions. The structure's weather tightness had been maintained through minimal intervention, with total repair investment reaching only $12.50 over the entire 40-year period. The operational efficiency advantages had accumulated into substantial economic benefits that validated Vaughn's initial investment in quality materials. Heating fuel requirements remained approximately 60% below comparable structures, creating annual savings that exceeded the original additional construction costs within the first decade. The compound effect of reduced maintenance, lower operational costs, and superior comfort had created value that multiplied year after year, proving that initial material quality determined lifetime economics more than construction speed or conventional practice. Modern understanding of wood science in 1919 provided technical validation for empirical knowledge that Vaughn had applied instinctively 4 decades earlier. The fiber saturation point concept explained why winter-cut, low-sap logs performed superior to summer-harvested timber. They approached equilibrium moisture content at installation, minimizing dimensional change during service life. Grain orientation studies confirmed that straight grain provided predictable, uniform shrinkage patterns, while spiral grain created torsional stress that expressed itself through warping and checking over time. Growth ring density research validated Vaughn's insistence on 12 rings per inch or greater, demonstrating that dense wood contained smaller cell structures and higher linen content that created superior dimensional stability and resistance to checking. Slope orientation effects were documented scientifically, showing that north-facing slopes produced more uniform density throughout log cross-sections by minimizing the formation of reaction wood that created internal stress patterns. Every empirical standard that neighbors had dismissed as perfectionist foolishness aligned precisely with emerging scientific understanding of wood behavior. Robert Vaughn, now 67 years old and recognized as the county's foremost authority on traditional construction, had become the unofficial consultant for new cabin projects. His wasteful methods were incorporated into official building recommendations, and experienced contractors sought his expertise when planning structures intended for long-term service. The transformation from community fool to respected expert reflected the broader recognition that traditional knowledge, properly applied, often surpassed contemporary practice in producing superior results. William Vaughn, Robert's son, had begun documenting the long-term economics of his father's approach with precision that provided quantifiable evidence of superior methodology. Father's careful selection added perhaps 3 weeks and $18 to the original construction cost, William recorded in detailed financial analysis. That investment has saved us approximately $280 in maintenance over 4 decades, not counting the labor hours and inconvenience avoided by living in a structure that requires minimal attention. The cultural impact extended far beyond individual building projects as Vaughn's influence spread through 3 counties. Before his death in 1924, Vaughn had taught his selection methods to 47 different builders who applied his standards to their own projects with consistently superior results. Cabins built using Vaughn's criteria showed dramatically improved longevity, reduced maintenance requirements, and enhanced comfort that created satisfied customers who recommended the methodology to other prospective builders. The phrase "Vaughn it" had entered local vocabulary, meaning to take extra time and care in material selection for any project where long-term performance mattered. Professional recognition came from unexpected quarters as university researchers studying traditional building methods specifically cited Vaughn's work. The University of Kentucky Forestry Department conducted detailed analysis of his selection criteria and construction results, concluding that his empirical understanding of wood science was remarkably sophisticated for a self-taught craftsman. Academic validation provided institutional credibility for knowledge that had been transmitted through generations of practical experience rather than formal education. The Depression era brought renewed appreciation for construction that minimized ongoing costs and maximized durability. Economic hardship made the value of Vaughn's approach more apparent as families struggled with the ongoing expenses of maintaining poorly constructed buildings. Analysis conducted during the 1930s revealed that Vaughn method cabins retained 85% of their value after 25 years of service, while standard construction lost 60% of value due to accumulated maintenance requirements and structural deterioration. The final irony of the 40-year assessment was that several descendants of the practical builders who had mocked Vaughn's methods in 1879 were now living in cabins constructed using his techniques. The wasteful perfectionist had solved a problem that the entire community hadn't recognized they had, creating standards that became the benchmark for quality construction throughout the region. His legacy proved that sometimes the apparent fool possesses the only real wisdom about the problem everyone else is trying to solve. 1939 marked the 60th anniversary of construction and the final validation of Robert Vaughn's revolutionary approach to frontier building. The Great Depression had taught a new generation harsh lessons about the value of things built to last, creating economic conditions that highlighted the wisdom of investing in quality materials over short-term savings. Professional assessment revealed a structure that had not merely survived 6 decades, but had outperformed every contemporary building by margins that defied conventional understanding of wood construction. 91% of Vaughn's original logs remained in active service, showing minimal checking or warping despite exposure to 60 Kentucky winters that had destroyed or severely damaged hundreds of conventionally built cabins throughout the county. The foundation remained perfectly level, corners stayed true to their original alignment, and walls showed no sagging or differential settling that plagued structures built with standard frontier methods. Interior conditions remained consistently dry even during severe storms that penetrated conventional construction, creating living spaces that required no seasonal adaptation or weather-dependent maintenance routines. Energy efficiency measurements conducted during the harsh winter of 1938 provided quantifiable evidence of superior thermal performance. Vaughn's cabin required 55 to 65% less heating fuel than comparable structures, creating annual savings that had compounded over 6 decades into substantial economic advantage. The tight-fitting logs maintained consistent thermal barriers that eliminated the air infiltration problems that forced residents of conventional cabins to burn additional firewood, compensating for heat loss through widening gaps and deteriorating chinking. The broader community impact of Vaughn's influence had spread far beyond his original county, creating a legacy of superior construction that validated traditional knowledge across 3 states. His teaching had reached 47 different builders before his death in 1924, and those craftsmen had trained additional apprentices who carried his methods into the 20th century. Cabins built using Vaughn's standards consistently showed 90% retention of structural integrity after 25 years of service, compared to 60% for standard construction that required major renovation or complete rebuilding within the same time frame. Economic analysis conducted during the Depression confirmed the financial wisdom of Vaughn's approach with precision that eliminated any lingering doubt about superior methodology. Structures built using his selection criteria retained 85% of their original value after 25 years, while conventionally built cabins lost 60% of value due to accumulated maintenance costs and structural deterioration. The initial investment in careful material selection and extended construction time had generated returns that multiplied annually through reduced operational costs and enhanced durability. Cultural transformation throughout the region reflected the complete reversal of community opinion that had occurred over 6 decades. The phrase "Vaughn it" had evolved from local usage to regional recognition, signifying any approach that prioritized long-term quality over short-term convenience. Extension agents routinely brought new homesteaders to examine Vaughn's construction methods, using the structure as a teaching model for proper log selection and building techniques. University researchers studying traditional building methods considered his cabin an essential research site for understanding pre-industrial construction science. William Vaughn, now maintaining his father's cabin in its seventh decade of service, reflected on lessons that transcended building construction. Grandfather always said, "Measure twice, cut once." William documented in family records that had become historical archives. Father expanded that principle to select carefully, build once. He understood that time spent choosing good materials was time saved over a lifetime of repairs, and his patience with selection prevented problems that plagued every other cabin in the county. Scientific validation from forestry experts provided institutional recognition for empirical knowledge that had been dismissed as folk wisdom 60 years earlier. University of Kentucky researchers confirmed that Vaughn's selection criteria aligned perfectly with modern understanding of wood stability, dimensional change, and long-term structural performance. Winter cutting minimized moisture content variables that created ongoing shrinkage problems. North slope timber produced consistent density characteristics that eliminated the internal stress patterns causing warping and checking. Slow growth created superior structural properties that maintained integrity under decades of seasonal stress cycles. The research implications extended beyond historical curiosity to influence contemporary building practices as architects and engineers studied traditional methods that produced superior results with available materials. Vaughn's systematic approach to log selection demonstrated principles of material science that remained valid regardless of technological advancement. His understanding of wood behavior, grain orientation, and moisture content effects provided insights that informed modern construction techniques, even as industrial materials replaced traditional timber framing. Professional recognition culminated in 1939 when the Kentucky Historical Society designated Vaughn's cabin as a heritage site, acknowledging construction techniques that had achieved performance levels unmatched by contemporary methods. The structure that neighbors had once dismissed as the product of wasteful perfectionism became an official testament to the superiority of traditional knowledge properly applied. Academic studies, professional assessments, and 60 years of documented performance had validated every aspect of Vaughn's methodology. The universal principle embodied in Vaughn's story transcended specific construction techniques to demonstrate fundamental truths about quality, craftsmanship, and long-term thinking. His rejection of short-term convenience in favor of superior materials created value that compounded over decades, proving that initial investments in quality generate returns that multiply annually through reduced maintenance costs and enhanced performance. The community that had mocked his standards as excessive perfectionism had learned through hard experience that his approach represented the only practical solution to problems they hadn't recognized they were creating. 4 generations of Vaughns had lived in the original structure by 1939, creating a family legacy that proved the wisdom of building for permanence rather than expedience. The cabin had served as home, workshop, and teaching laboratory, demonstrating daily the advantages of construction methods that prioritized long-term performance over immediate convenience. Children and grandchildren had grown up in spaces that required no seasonal adaptation, no weather-dependent maintenance, and no compromise with comfort during severe weather conditions that made conventionally built cabins nearly uninhabitable. The final assessment in 1939 revealed a structure that had achieved what frontier builders considered impossible. 60 years of superior performance with minimal maintenance intervention. Robert Vaughn's legacy proved definitively that traditional knowledge, systematically applied, could produce results that surpassed contemporary practice by margins that justified any initial investment in superior methodology. His story became a permanent reminder that sometimes the apparent fool possesses the only genuine wisdom about problems everyone else is struggling unsuccessfully to solve.